Yes, people, what's happening? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another live stream. And fresh off the 6-week break for the World Cup, we're hurtling straight into the January transfer window, and there's certainly going to be a lot of activity going on. A lot of clubs needing to do work, and no club potentially is going to be more busier than Chelsea in this January window. You know, a lot of players need to come in, potentially some outgoings as well, as Graham Potter's boys look to try and close that 8-point gap on the Champions League spaces, which are going to be really crucial for next season, and potentially recruitment as well. Obviously, Christopher Nkunku already confirmed for next summer. He's going to be a Chelsea player from July 2023, but there's still positions that urgently need addressing in January. Obviously, a backup centre forward for Armando Broja, potentially reinforcements in midfield, and maybe a backup right back for Reece James as well. And joining me to discuss this plus more is Ben Jacobs. Ben, thanks for coming as always, mate. Really appreciate it. Let's get straight into it then. Let's start with Chelsea's pursuit for a backup centre forward or another centre forward to replace the injured Armando Broja, who's obviously out with an ACL for the whole season. Let's start with Youssoufa Moukoko. The Borussia Dortmund youngster is obviously out of contract at the end of this season. Dortmund are desperate to keep him. He's done phenomenally well in their youth teams with a great goal scoring record. Obviously went to the World Cup with Germany, became their youngest ever player to play at a World Cup. Chelsea believed to be in the front seat for his signature. What's the latest on that, and how realistic is a January arrival for Moukoko at Stamford Bridge?
Well, they're in the front seat because both the old regime and the new regime have allocated the player, and there's not a direct link actually between that, other than there's obviously members of staff that have transitional crossover between the two regimes. But the point I'm making is that some of Chelsea's newer recruitment staff and Marina from the old regime both felt like this was a player that would be a good fit for Chelsea. And the reason why, especially with the new multi-club model and the onus being placed on youth, is because he's 18 years of age, he's versatile, he's already been capped at international level. And as far as his form for Dortmund is concerned, he's scoring goals, he's contributing with assists, he's moving around the field well, he's timing his off-the-ball runs effectively, he's pulling defenders out of positions, and that gives Graham Potter goals, assists and versatility, and all at a young age. And I think there's a real belief at Chelsea that although Moukoko is a player for the squad and for the future, he can also very much be thrown in for the now, and Armando Broja falls into that category as well. So Chelsea are very much interested, but it's a finely poised situation. And I have to add that in the past, Liverpool have looked, Manchester United are in the race, Tottenham are big admirers, and Barcelona to some extent are there as well. La Liga is a possible destination because the player's head is a little bit turned by that Barcelona interest, or at least it was last summer when the groundwork was laid. But Barcelona, as I understand it, will only move if he becomes a free transfer. So you've got two scenarios. One is that clubs escalate the situation and put some money down in January, and the other is that they work towards potentially a summer transfer. And all of this is complicated by the fact that, as you say, Dortmund would love to renew the deal. So his agent has said very openly that nothing is close at the moment, and Chelsea and other clubs need to understand what is feasible. Because if they, in talks with the player, can persuade him not to sign a new deal, it allows potentially for a January transfer, because Dortmund are then in a position where they either have to take some money or no money. If Chelsea are made to wait and a new contract is signed, and that's still what Dortmund are pushing for, and obviously from the player's perspective, he'll leverage any interest in order to get the best possible deal if he chooses to go down that route. But if a new contract is signed, then January becomes off the table. And then we could be in a situation a bit like Nkunku, where new deal doesn't mean no summer transfer. It just means a summer transfer at a higher price than now. And that's where, as when Nkunku signed a new deal, the player will insist upon a release clause that is either at market value or below market value to make sure that he can still sign and ultimately leave at the same time. So there's a lot of moving parts here, but the reason why Chelsea are ahead of the suitors that I mentioned is because they allocated this player across a number of different windows with a view to progressing it for the summer. And they, like many, take heart in the fact that no new deal yet has been signed. But you can get played here as clubs because often an agent will allow the window to open, will allow even talks and an offer to come in, and then they'll come back to the club and say, right, you now know that there are very credible options at this wage, at this contract length, and so on. And it can all help in the negotiations. So I think that the point with Chelsea is that it fits what they're looking for exactly. And there's a bit more urgency because now Broja is injured, even though Datro Fofana is also on the verge of signing. He's maybe a bit more for the future, whereas I feel like with Moukoko and his international experience and his Bundesliga experience and his goal-scoring record this season, you could throw him straight into the first team, even though he's only at the age of 18. He only just turned 18, by the way, as well, in November. So really still very much a teenager, lots of capability to improve. And therefore, Chelsea can kind of get a win-win. They could throw him into the mix in the short term, and then they can develop him in the long term and provide pathways to be a very integral player that offers a lot. So there is a possibility, but it's not all in Chelsea's control. The control is on the Chelsea to player side, where they've put in a lot of legwork, they've developed relationships, they've done their scouting and due diligence, all without placing an offer, all without making a move in the market. But he's there and he's in their thoughts, and there is consensus across this new recruitment team that he fits exactly what they're looking for in the long run. But it's complicated by the fact that if he suddenly signs a new deal at Dortmund, then not only is January off the table, but the price that would have to be paid in the summer becomes a lot higher.
And in terms of kind of other options, I mean, I've seen varying things saying that Chelsea may look to potentially bring a player in on loan, maybe, perhaps not a permanent signing, if they can get by with a short-term option till the end of the season, and then Broja can come back into the fold potentially. A couple of names are exciting Chelsea fans like myself and many others. Two Portuguese players, Rafael Leao and obviously João Felix as well. If we start with João Felix, obviously not had the best of times at Atletico Madrid. You could argue that Simeone's playing style maybe stifles his ability to perform at his best. Hasn't got the best relationship with the manager at the moment. I think I've seen that the president or the CEO of Atletico Madrid saying that they don't get on so well, and he probably is going to leave, even though they'd like him to stay. Is Felix a reasonable target for Chelsea in January, or do we think that that's just a no-goer?
Well, when you look at January, you have to understand that it's a quiet window, it's a quick window, and Chelsea have already spent over 250 million, and we know that they're planning for Declan Rice, if they can get him, 70 to 85 million. And on top of that, if they were to enter the race for Jude Bellingham, and I don't think they're going to get Rice and Bellingham, but they need to allocate budget there. So if you bring Felix into the mix as well, you're suddenly looking at three humongous windows, and Chelsea don't have that luxury of signing a star that is the missing piece in the puzzle. They need multiple personnel because of the volumes of outgoings over the summer, because of the midfield revamp that is needed, aging players like Kante and Jorginho not guaranteed being at the club, Pulisic and Ziyech with uncertain futures. We don't know whether Aubameyang will stay for a significantly long period. So there's a lot of moving parts. And then, of course, once all that's done, you have to start saying in 2-3 seasons' time, there will be a need to replace or add depth for the likes of Koulibaly and Silva. And I say add depth because obviously there are young players like Fofana coming in, and Levi Colwell as well, who's only on loan at Brighton. So there might be some in-house options, but there's still that ability. And no doubt Chelsea fans will also be saying the same about Azpilicueta and wondering whether a right-back is going to come in sooner rather than later. So the maths has to add up. And if you spend one outlay on a João Felix, it can then be at the expense potentially of the 3 or 4 other key positions that you need, because Chelsea can't keep spending 250 million on 4 to 7 players and chipping away at talented youth. And even though those fees will go a bit more under the radar, if it's Chukwuemeka 20 million and then Datro Fofana 10 million, and each window you try and bring in 2 or 3 of them, that's probably another 30 to 50 million of spend, which can be staggered, can be put in payments, but ultimately it will all eventually add up on your books. So Chelsea won't move for João Felix in that context unless he becomes available at more of a bargain fee. And there are other clubs who are far more interested in Joao Felix than Chelsea at this point. So everyone will always scout a player like him. And the potential is because when you watch him play internationally, he looks freer. At Atletico Madrid, he doesn't fit with the manager's philosophy. He doesn't seemingly love the style. And that's why we've had this Free Felix campaign on social media. But Atleti are not taking any of that and offering a cut price deal. And therefore, you're looking at probably at a minimum 85 million. And even that, talking to sources in the market, is low. Some say 100 million. Some will even go as high as 115 million. I don't think that it will quite be to that nature, but I think you're looking at around 100 million if we average what all the sources say. There's one or two clubs that believe that they'll find a bargain deal. There's other clubs that are worried that it will become a bidding war. And that's because so many clubs are looking at him. Arsenal are not seriously advanced, but what they have done is gone to the player side. That's part of due diligence for the window. And Chelsea will do the same. And also, one thing to point out is you will always go to these kind of agents just to ask the question, because you're not only expressing interest when you hold talks with the players' camp, you're also yardsticking. So in the same way that Chelsea's sale price is now a yardstick for Liverpool and for Manchester United, and prior to that, Newcastle were looking at previous sales before PIF went in and trying to yardstick what they thought was valuation at the time. And they effectively got a bargain deal, PIF, because of the circumstances. And if they qualify for the Champions League, they'll at least double that price. And it's the same with the transfer. You want to know what Joao Felix is priced at if you're Chelsea, even if you don't plan on moving, because you're going to have to go in the market for others in similar positions with similar ages, with similar profiles. And you want that leverage. You want that industry knowledge. You want that ability to work out who's a bargain, who's market value, who's above market value. And you may need that in your negotiations, because even though no player is like for like, if everyone knows Chelsea want a goal scorer and you've got Leao and you've got Felix, and potentially the price being quoted for Leao is 150 million euros, you may go to Felix's camp to find out he's only 100 million. And then you may go back to Milan and you may say, well, listen, why am I going to give you an extra 50 million when I could just move for Felix, who will also get us goals, who will also be attack-minded, who can also provide assists, and he's 50 million cheaper. So you've got to reduce your price or we'll walk away. And this is where a lot of links come from at this time, because people are just sort of dipping their toes into the water. So I don't genuinely think there's too much with Chelsea and Joao Felix at this point. With Leao, it's different because we know that there's a long-standing interest, but still Milan are not ruling out a new deal being signed. So Chelsea are in a wait-and-see situation because there's no way they're going to pay 150 million euros release clause, which means they either have to wait until the summer and see whether the price drops, or they have to hope that if the player doesn't sign a new deal, they can then swoop in maybe towards the end of the window and say, listen, he's not signing. You know it, we know it. So we're offering you this now. We think it's a fair deal. Take it, or you're going to get a whole lot less come the summer. So that's the sort of situation with Leao. I don't actually think it's moved significantly since the summer when Chelsea tried at the end of the window. And then with the forwards generally, it would once again be more prudent for Chelsea to buy young and cheaper, or loan, which is a very realistic possibility. Put some faith in Ziyech or Pulisic. Both could go, but both could stay. Both had good World Cups. So put some faith in one or both of them. See what happens. Get everybody fit as soon as you can. Make the midfield more of a priority. They need goals, of course, but you can give Sterling that freer forward-minded role instead of asking him to play wing-back where he doesn't look comfortable. You've still got Aubameyang there as well. And if a Pulisic or a Ziyech in the next month or two chipped in with a little bit, Chelsea might feel a little bit calmer. So they need goals, because obviously Broja's out until the end of the season, but it's not replacing Broja's goals, because it's not like he's stood up despite his potential and added 10 this season or anything. It's really that pressure, I think, on Havertz and on Sterling to chip in and feel more comfortable in whatever role he's given. And then somebody creatively, a Mount, a Ziyech, a Pulisic, has to be the one that says, I'm going to kind of do what a Miguel Almiron has done at Newcastle and find 4 or 5 goals in the next month. So it's intriguing because Chelsea are kind of summer planning, but they are going to have to do something as far as the forward line is concerned in January, not just because of Broja, but they're simply not scoring enough goals.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, just one more on the forward line before we move on. News that you've covered, Dusan Vlahovic at Juventus supposedly could maybe be available. Obviously, we know that Juventus are going through a few issues with alleged false accounting, which could see them face sporting penalties and heavy financial sanctions. But he only joined Juventus last January in quite a big money move from Fiorentina. So I was quite surprised to hear his name potentially rumoured as maybe being on the move in January. What's the latest on that? And are Chelsea one of the clubs that could be sniffing around that deal?
Well, Vlahovic is available. That's the first thing to say. Many scouts at many top clubs have told me there is, quote, a 100% opportunity with Vlahovic in 2023. Some are far, far more likely than mid-season. But Juventus' situation is fluid. A new board is coming in. They're under investigation from Turin prosecutors for alleged financial malpractice. We don't categorically know whether there'll be any sporting sanctions. They're not guaranteed Champions League football. Their finances are not great because of the failed Super League. And also, in addition, the pandemic, and a lot of top Serie A clubs were hit particularly hard by that. Gate receipts are a little bit more important in Serie A in the overall financial context than in the Premier League. So Juventus might be forced to sell. Weston McKennie could be another name that goes, and Tottenham are one of the clubs looking at him. So Vlahovic just doesn't enjoy his football as much as he did at Fiorentina. That's not to say that he's desperate to leave. That's not to say that there's been some big acrimonious fallout. It's definitely not like João Felix and Diego Simeone, but he's not thriving under Max Allegri in the day-to-day. He doesn't enjoy the training and the style as much as he did at Fiorentina. So yes, that is a comparative point. And to reiterate, he's not so desperately unhappy at Juventus that he'll be handing in a transfer request or anything like that. But when you add that to Max Allegri's own uncertainty, he could easily go at the end of the season. Juventus keeps saying Max Allegri will be there at least until the end of the season. But again, there's a new board coming in who may make new decisions. And all of this breeds a bit of uncertainty. So Vlahovic has only been at the club for a year. His numbers are good. 6 goals, I think, in 10 Serie A games this season. But he didn't have a World Cup to really rave about. And he has groin problems. He's injured at the moment with a groin injury. And although it may not be so worryingly significant as far as the second half of the season is concerned, there's ongoing tests because the groin issue has been persistent for Vlahovic. So that's another factor that clubs are going to have to understand. So I would be surprised if January is possible because of the price and because of it being mid-season. But I think that clubs are kind of on red alert. They know that for the right offer, the player would be willing to move. And Chelsea are one of those clubs, therefore, that will track the situation. And either in January or the summer, it's one of those deals where it's the right time to move in the market. And if the opportunity presents itself, then there's definitely a chance that he could move. And that will be disappointing to Juventus fans. But it's a reflection of the fact, perhaps, that maybe he made the wrong decision in joining Juventus in the first place. And if his goal numbers are good now, when he's not entirely happy or settled, what might they be like in the Premier League if he joins the right club? People will link Arsenal as well, but there's been no re-advance from them at this point. In January of this year, they did bid and they tried to quite bullishly land the player ahead of Juventus, and all it did was catalyse Juventus to actually move a window earlier. So Juve's plan was actually Vlahovic last summer, but when they realised that Arsenal was serious, they chose to move up their bid one window early, and from that point onwards, he wanted Juventus. Now I think he's kind of looking at Arsenal's season and the Premier League and the money and Juventus's instability and the possible lack of Champions League football next season. And who knows, the financial situation could lead to some kind of sporting sanction. And when you add all that up, it's very unstable times. So even if Juventus wanted to keep Vlahovic, they might be forced to cash in for the right offer. So I think it's more one to watch in the summer, but we can't categorically rule out a January transfer, but to trigger that, a massive offer would be needed. And if we talk specifically about Chelsea, I don't see them paying above the odds. And people will always ask me, and they do the same with Leao, well, why can't we just bid low and offer a player? Because everybody knows Pulisic would quite like Serie A. Everybody knows that Ziyech would quite like a move to Milan. But you have to understand that to a fan, if you said, we'll give you Ziyech, Pulisic, and we'll take Leao in the other direction, and we'll give you, and I'll easily get the maths here wrong because I've not really valued Pulisic and Ziyech, but I'll give you 10 million, let's just say, for the hell of it. So by that maths, we're saying it's just for the heck of it, even though these aren't accurate per player. It's sort of 65 million for Pulisic, it's 65 million for Ziyech, and then it's 10 million in cash on top of that, all totaling 130 odd million, roughly 150 million euros, let's just say. My maths is bad, so don't quote me on these figures because I'm hypothetically giving you them. And fans will say, great, we've only had to spend 10 million. We've got Leao. We were going to get rid of Pulisic anyway. We were going to get rid of Ziyech anyway. So there we go. But the reality of the situation is the club, any club, will still look at that collective number and ask one question. Is Rafa Leao or is Dusan Vlahovic worth X? And it doesn't matter whether you get to X by just gifting a couple of players that you can then offset the physical cash spend. If they still feel that they've paid above the odds, regardless of how much actual cash they've paid, they'll walk away. And that's not just because they are not prepared to make the move. It's also because they're braced for what message that sends to the market. So a secondary point and a minor point in all of this is just Chelsea can't be the club, whether it's cash or whether it's cash plus player, to keep paying above market value. Because even if the player succeeds, it weakens them significantly in the market when they're negotiating and they end up getting used. So Marc Cucurella, whether he's a long-standing success at Chelsea or not, was miles above market value, which is why Manchester City walked away. And clubs that didn't even bid before Chelsea came in the race said he's not even worth 30 million. Chelsea paid 62 all in if everything ends up getting paid to Brighton. Carney Chukwuemeka was a player that lots of clubs were looking at, but nowhere near the 20 million that was paid, again, if all fees are hit. So it feels great to a fan to just say, have these players that were leaving anyway, we'll give you this money, we'll do a swap deal. But this is Bowley learning on the job. And Chelsea just need to be careful that they don't get who they want, but not for the right price. Because otherwise, the next deal and the next deal and the next deal that they do, they'll be more and more handcuffed, which is why they walked away for Anthony Gordon, which is why they handled the Fofana deal very well and didn't pay a world record fee. That actually strengthens them in the market. So it's not only who you sign, but it's how you sign them. And the how part of a previous signing can actually influence the market and either strengthen or weaken you, depending on how you conducted your business when you then go for the next name.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, obviously, one area that desperately needs revamping, needs bodies to come through the door is midfield. It's been like that for a number of years now. Chelsea haven't really signed a top central midfield player since N'Golo Kante. Arguably haven't really replaced Nemanja Matic from all those years ago either. So desperate to get bodies in there. Jorginho and Kante most likely could both be leaving on a free transfer at the end of the season. As you touched on, Declan Rice is going to be definitely one for the summer that Chelsea will look to heavily pursue. Again, Jude Bellingham could be another name that Chelsea look to go in for in the summer. But in terms of January, Ben, what can we expect in midfield? I mean, I know that Chelsea ideally want 2 or 3 midfield players, but ideally it's going to be 1 in January, one in the summer. In terms of January targets, do you expect Chelsea to potentially go back in for Edson Alvarez of Ajax at all?
Well, before the new recruitment team came in, it was made very clear that Edson Alvarez was a priority and a midfielder that Chelsea would be returning for. And after he didn't turn up for training on the final day of the window to try and force through the move, he was to some extent reassured by Chelsea that they would return for him. But things change, personnel change, and now there's a recruitment team building, including Christopher Vivell, who's come in to start immediately as technical director. and Lawrence Stewart, who will start in February as well, so won't influence this window. Plus, of course, a new manager in Graham Potter, Kyle McCauley, his recruitment specialist, Paul Winstanley as well. So there's a lot more voices now, and Todd Boehly and Bedag Eghbali may change their opinion on players. But the midfield is a challenge because it needs revamping. So if Chelsea could only get 2 in the January window, and it won't be a huge January in terms of personnel, I think that if the numbers add up anything higher than 2 or 3, it will only be because they've brought in young talent. But if you look at the now, I don't see Chelsea bringing in 4, 5, 6 like they did in the summer, because then they don't really leave themselves any leeway for next summer, where they probably will want to spend big again. So it is important to note that January is about the right targets. January is about urgency and need. So if they buy a midfielder in January, it can't conflict with their strategy in the summer, were they to feel they're going to be successful with either a Declan Rice or a Jude Bellingham. Again, to reiterate, I don't think that they're necessarily front runners for Bellingham. I don't think they're remotely planning on landing both, but naturally you put yourself in the race for these players. And if you're doing that and you bring in quality in January as well, then perhaps you overstock that midfield, because let's not forget, at the same time, they're not ruling out offering Kante and or Jorginho new deals. Kante's just miles off terms and contract length, and Jorginho, it's formative and will progress during the new year. So we have to wait and see. And there's obviously still Kovacic there, Conor Gallagher there, and so on. So there are midfielders, but not the right midfielders in terms of the wages they're earning or the age. So a revamp is needed, but we have to wait and see how seriously Chelsea choose to move now versus in the summer. And this can be said for a range of other targets as well. Caicedo, who I don't think will be sold in this window. So could that be a name that Graham Potter goes for? My understanding is actually that Chelsea are not necessarily banking on that. They're not necessarily planning on that, but it will need more voices as this recruitment panel or transfer committee develops. So people will always make a link now between, say, Alexis McAllister and Chelsea because of Graham Potter, Moses Caicedo and Chelsea because of Graham Potter, and Paul Winstanley and Kyle McCauley. But it's not as simple as that. He won't necessarily keep raiding Brighton. And with Alexis McAllister, Brighton have got plenty of control post-World Cup. He'll be there for sure throughout January. And they're pretty confident because of his contractual situation that they can keep hold of him for at least a season or 2 still. So that's not really a short-term possibility. But again, you have to work out, if you know you're planning for, and this is where Chelsea have been bad, because of sanctions, because of uncertainty, because of sales. So it's not pointing fingers at individuals, it's just the reality. They're behind their rivals in forward planning because of the structure they had, because of the sanctions they had, because of the sale they had, because of the new owners coming in. So when this new recruitment panel is built, they've got 2 technical directors now, one with a global focus, Lawrence Stewart, one more for now with a Chelsea focus in Christopher Vivell. They're the ones with a wider scouting team that can start saying, who are we going to buy in the summer or next January or the summer of 2024? And if, for example, that was a McAllister, it will influence what they do now, because the last thing they want to do is lay down 50 million now for a player that they know is only really going to be a stopgap, because actually they think they're going to get X, Y, or Z in a couple of windows' time. So it is this balance between needing to improve now versus, if you can't get the right name now, kind of strategizing to make sure that you don't miss out on a priority target in a few windows' time, which is why the fans have to be a little bit patient. And I know that's not what people want to hear, but if they put down 200 million now, and that is actually at the expense then of priority targets in the summer, next January, the summer of 2024, that's not a good approach either, because what you get is a short-term gain. And then suddenly Chelsea are no longer in the race for Rice. Chelsea are no longer in the race for Bellingham because they've spent their money under financial fair play, or they've stocked their position and they've handed out all these long-term contracts. So there has to be this balance between the now, and of course there's an urgency in midfield, versus the future. And if you can't get a name now, sometimes you as a recruitment team and as a fan base have to be a bit more patient.
And in terms of another name that I've kind of seen crop up a few times, and it was mentioned, I think, right at the end of the summer window, Romeo Lavia at Southampton, a player that Chelsea supposedly had been interested in. There was reports saying that Chelsea did put a bid in on deadline day, but then some other contrasting reports saying that they didn't. He's obviously a player that's on Chelsea's radar, would fit the model of being young, under 25, to build the bulk of the squad that Todd Bowley's looking to do. I would say January is unlikely. I know Southampton are struggling. New manager Nathan Jones has just come in, but again, that'll take a lot of money to get him out of Southampton at this point in time. Is he a player that we could see Chelsea sort of pushing a little bit harder for in the next couple of windows?
It's going to be difficult in January, certainly not impossible, but Southampton are obviously not happy about Joe Shields joining. He's not in place yet because of the so-called gardening leave or cooling off period, but there was a whole friction between Ralph Hasenhüttl and Joe Shields, and essentially Shields spotted and brought in Lavia, but Hasenhüttl didn't want to give him any credit and denies that he had anything to do with it. And quite clearly, Southampton are not going to want to let him go, and especially not to Chelsea, given the circumstances of Shields' departure. So that is going to influence things. And of course, clubs have cordial relationships. You could argue Brighton should hate Chelsea more than any other club, but actually Todd Bowley and Paul Barber have got a tremendous relationship, which is why business gets done, and two-way business as well. Levi Colwell on loan to Brighton, Billy Gilmore sold just before Graham Potter left for Chelsea. So that's what you want, but Chelsea don't quite have that relationship with Southampton, and it remains to be seen whether they can pull anything off with Lavia, or if Southampton are going to ultimately keep hold of him, first and foremost because he's new to the club, and second of all because they don't have that much depth. And to lose a young player like him when all of their signings at large over the last window were gambling on youth, were building for the long term, it would be seen as very unambitious of them and very ambitious of Chelsea to get that one done in January. But we wait and see. Obviously, a player a number of clubs are looking at, and we'll see whether that's possible in the short term. But January for me isn't necessarily about Chelsea bringing a player like that, because that's, again, Chelsea's long-term strategy. That, again, is a player that will improve and develop. Whereas even though they've got Kante and Jorginho and Kovacic all very experienced, I think that because they see in the next window or three that those players could depart, especially if Kante and Jorginho don't sign a new transfer. From Kante's perspective, he becomes available on a free. So I think they want someone with a bit more experience for the now that can be thrown straight in. And that's where there's one or two other names that are worth considering. So there are midfielders out there in the market. And I'll clarify on two names just briefly. First of all, Yuri Tielemans, because lots of people have been atting me about that. I went on another podcast, and what I said is a player like Yuri Tielemans is available on the market because he doesn't want to sign a new deal and maybe provides Premier League experience and goals. And you would understand, therefore, if Chelsea were to at least consider him. I then added that no advance yet, there's been no approach yet, there's been no priority yet. And of course, it got quoted everywhere as Chelsea enter the race for Tielemans. And that is inaccurate from what I said. And it is inaccurate from any kind of Chelsea perspective at this point. However, Tielemans is cost effective now and could even be a free transfer over the summer. So that's where Arsenal are thinking about if they can put some money down in January or if they can lock in the player for the summer, because Arsenal's the club that Tielemans wants to join. But I used him as an example of the type of player that is available in the market, either now or in the summer, that's cost effective and does have proven Premier League experience, which is why it's a name and a transfer to watch. But again, because people only lift one line, somehow that got turned into Chelsea are rivaling Arsenal for Tielemans, when ironically neither Chelsea or Arsenal have yet done anything with Tielemans. But names like this will come up in conversation. The other one that I think is really interesting, even though everyone's talking about Morocco's Great World Cup and Amrabat, is actually Ounahi, who hopefully will be named in the team of the tournament. I actually haven't seen the team of the tournament from FIFA yet, but both Amrabat and Ounahi are in my team of the tournament. And the thing about Ounahi is that he's only 22. He is at Angers at the moment. He's been there since 2021-22. He is a very disciplined midfielder. He likes to get forwards when he can. He's not afraid to take a long-range effort. He's not known as a goal scorer by any stretch of the imagination. That's not in his bag. He's actually a better goal scorer for Morocco, though, than he's been for Angers. I think he's scored as many goals for Morocco in under 20 appearances as he has for Angers in something like 50. But a lot of potential there. And again, at a very cost-effective price. So I think that, not specific to Chelsea, but there's several Premier League clubs looking at him. Leicester are one of them. Leeds United are another. Newcastle scouted him during the World Cup, but haven't made any direct approach to the player camp. So this is the type of name. And I say this really to move on to a slightly broader point, which is that Chelsea want to invest in France. Players playing in France and young French players. Obviously, Anahi doesn't fall into that category, but he's playing within the French system. It's not just about a young French player. It's about the development of a player within the French system. And Angers is a club that is 100% available for sale. An American consortium tried over the summer and it fell through. But there's lots of clubs in France that are available for either sale, investment, or partnership. So the fact that Chelsea are looking in France for young talent, and the fact that a player like Anahi is available for sale and at a cost-effective price, all kind of adds up to the direction of travel. So I certainly wouldn't say at this point that Chelsea are there and talking to the player or considering a January bid, but it's just one to watch because it tells you what the strategy is. They want to buy young, we know that. And then we have to start looking at where regionally are they looking at, both to buy or invest in a club and for talent. And the French system, Ligue 1 clubs, lower league French clubs, one key area. Belgium, another key area. Portugal, another key area. Brazil, some would say, another area. Although in Brazil, I think it's less about the infrastructure and more about specific individuals. Endrick was one they tried for. But this, again, with Endrick is very interesting that it was billed, wasn't it, as Chelsea, PSG and Real Madrid are in the race for Endrick. But that was not my understanding. My understanding was always that Real Madrid were confident, and plenty of other clubs that knew Endrick's family and developed relationships with Endrick's family as early as 2021 walked away because they said that he was always going to join Real Madrid. So this is another example of Chelsea not realizing as early as some of their rivals, or just feeling like they would be ambitious and deciding to try and defy the odds. But if it's the former, they were later to Endrick without a realization that some of their other rivals walked away because they always knew that it was highly, highly unlikely he would join anyone other than Real Madrid. So this is another learning for the new regime. It's not a criticism, but they have to assess what is viable, and Santos, for example, might be, and what is unlikely, and how much time and energy directly or through intermediaries do they want to put in deals that may not come off. So as soon as PSG put down their offer and it wasn't accepted, they walked away because they were like, we thought he was joining Real. We tried our luck. He wasn't interested. We were no longer interested. Chelsea did do something similar. So they handled it okay, but they were quite late in the process. Whereas a club, for example, like Liverpool, as I understand it, knew they didn't stand a chance. Not now, not over the summer, not in January, but in the summer of 2021. They knew that Endrick was likely to join Real Madrid, so they never pursued it. And that's another key factor in January, that when you have limited time, you have to scramble. And as we saw towards the close of the last window, Chelsea scrambled from Edson Alvarez to Zakaria. And it was a mad rush. They scrambled to get Aubameyang done. They kind of had to because they were brand new in the job. And they did really well to really handle that window, considering they were new to the job. But now they need to learn those lessons and make sure that in January, a short window, their time and energy is focused on what is realistic. And as they build more industry knowledge, they will understand where they should be putting their resources, which is why they've got all these new recruitment experts, because they come in with the experience to know how to handle the market.
Yeah, for sure. By the way, guys, keep smashing the likes on the stream and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. We'd really appreciate it. Ben, just wanted to round out with a couple of two young players very briefly, probably ones for the future. What is the latest on Vasco da Gama midfielder Andre Santos, as far as you understand? Because I've read things that say that Chelsea are pretty close to getting that deal done. Obviously, as we just discussed, missed out on Endrick. Another youngster for the future central midfield player. Can we expect that to be wrapped up in January?
We'll wait and see on this one. It's difficult because until the multi-club model is built and the pathways are clear, all Chelsea can really do is pitch theoretically to a player and guarantee that their development will either involve being in the first team, being loaned out somewhere, and there's not necessarily a precedent under the new regime for the development of young talent. But what there is some evidence with, say, Broja, that they'll throw long-term contracts out there and they'll financially both reward with a base wage and incentivize these young players. So Chelsea are there and in the mix, and they are growing increasingly confident. So we'll have to wait and see if they can get it over the line. But there is a feeling that they've moved ahead of Newcastle in the race for this one. So we're just going to now have to wait and see whether or not a fee can be agreed. So Vasco da Gama wanted, I think, originally 25 million all in, including add-ons. And when Newcastle and PSG approached, they wanted to pay 8 million up front and then 10 million in add-ons. So that would be 18 million in total. My understanding is that Chelsea's base offer guaranteed fee is going to be over 10 million. And then we wait and see what the add-ons carry it to. So that, financially speaking, will allow them to do a bit what they did with Chukwuemeka and work to get a fee that ultimately is acceptable to Vasco da Gama. And then from there, it's just about whether the player is confident in the move. So Newcastle thought that they were ahead in this race. Now Chelsea are ahead in this race. And we wait and see what the fee is, because what you have to remember with Santos is that back in January, when Newcastle were first exploring this move, so that's 2 windows ago now, the fee being touted was much closer to 30, even 35 million, including add-ons. So it's also going to be about the structure of the deal. It's going to be about any sell-on percentage as well. So there's a little bit of work to be done. And the Newcastle links obviously came originally from the fact that he shares the same agent, Bertolucci Sports, as Bruno at Newcastle. So I think everyone felt like the links between agency and the Bruno factor, because players are always heavily more involved in the pitch now, might get that one over the line, but it didn't. So this one isn't done, but I do think it's fair to say that Chelsea are leading the race. I know fans hate hearing the word leading the race, but that's exactly what a transfer window is. There's twists, there's changes, there's hijack bids. Barcelona at one point were there. PSG were there at one point. Manchester City still could come back in as well. But Chelsea seemingly are at the front of the queue. And to explain what I mean by that, because it can mean different things, it means that they are confident and progressing on the financial side and the club-to-club side to build a deal. And then it depends whether the player gives any green light as well. So we'll see how that one progresses in January.
And just very briefly, Ben, like it's just for a couple of minutes, just a couple of people in the chat asking about Arsene Zakarian. Obviously, that was one kind of carrying over from the summer. There are obvious issues with where the finances will end up due to Russia and the conflict going on in Russia and Ukraine. Has that been resolved? Can we expect that deal to be done in January, or are there still a few things that need to be sorted out there?
Well, the deal collapsed last summer for really reasons outside of Chelsea or the players' control, the sanctions and the war in Ukraine. And at that point, the 19-year-old had agreed on personal terms to a move to Stamford Bridge. He was gutted when it fell through. It's a dream move for him. And the fact that those personal terms were agreed tells you that Chelsea wanted it to happen. And not a lot has changed. So there's no significant update. Negotiations are complex, though. A January move can't be ruled out, but it is by no means definite because of the ability to legally get the transfer done. And I know there were some reports about him changing nationality, but that's been denied by his agent and even the player directly. And therefore, the easiest loophole doesn't exist at this point. So it's really about Chelsea trying to find a solution at this point. It's not impossible that he moves to Chelsea. It's a move that Zakarian wants, but it has to be legally permissible under the FIFA rules, which is still impacted by the war in Ukraine. So it's not a problem agreeing a deal with Dinamo because there's a release clause at just over 12 million, and Chelsea are quite prepared to trigger that. It's not a problem agreeing a deal with Zakarian either. But we're sort of still where we were at over the summer, in the sense that there are hurdles that would normally be not applicable within a football environment. And Chelsea are going to almost have to do this one, not just via their recruitment team, but via their lawyers if they're to get it done. So there really isn't a significant update, not one that I'm aware of on this front. We know that Chelsea are still looking. We know that Chelsea are still exploring. We know that Chelsea are still hoping. And all of that exploration and hope is not around, can a deal be done with the club or can a deal be done with the player? All of that's kind of already in place. It's just whether or not they can find a way to get it done in January and do so within FIFA's rules.
No, definitely. I mean, yes, these are good points to round out. Ben, thanks so much for your time. Thanks for your insight and thanks for the updates. January is certainly going to be a busy time for Chelsea. I'm sure, we've not had much to cheer about on the pitch in the first half of the season. So I'm sure a few signings in January would really boost the mood and set the Blues up for hopefully a strong second half of the season and to finally finish in those top 4 places. But yeah, guys, make sure you smash the likes on the stream, subscribe to the channel on your way out. Make sure you follow Ben on Twitter as well, linked in the description, also on his screen name there, for all the best footballing updates. And guys, I will catch you in the next couple of days with a preview for the Bournemouth game. But until then, take care and up the Chels.